The plane had barely begun boarding when murmurs started, spreading among the flight attendants. A last-minute change in seating. A first-class ticket printed in D.C., an anonymous. VIP gate agents had instructions. But no name was ever spoken. Only a sealed envelope passed from hand to hand marked with a presidential seal. The cabin crew traded glances, wondering who it could be. Then he appeared, wearing a charcoal suit, blue tie, and aviator sunglasses. Joe Biden quietly stepped into the aircraft. His expression was calm, almost unreadable, as if he were more lost in thought than concerned about recognition. He walked past the first few rows of coach, where several passengers raised their heads in surprise, and entered the first-class cabin. He didn't expect a fanfare. In fact, he didn't want it. Joe Biden, once the most powerful man on Earth, was flying commercial. No cameras, no aides, just a black duffel bag, in the weariness of a man who hadn't slept much the night before. As he found his seat, 2A by the window, he noticed a young man already sitting there. Torn jeans, plaid shirt, unshaven, maybe in his late 30s. The man was reclined comfortably, headphones on, legs crossed like he'd lived in that seat for years. Joe paused. He double-checked his boarding pass. 2A. The man in the seat didn't look up. Joe gently tapped him on the shoulder. "Excuse me, I believe that's my seat." The man pulled off one earbud and looked up slowly. His eyes flicked from Joe's face to the boarding pass in his hand. He scoffed. "I got here first, old man." Joe blinked, not in anger but in stunned disbelief. I'm sorry." The flight attendant noticed the rising tension and rushed over. "Sir, everything all right?" Joe stepped slightly aside. "There seems to be a mix-up. This is my seat." The attendant looked at both men, then at the manifest. "Yes, sir. 2A is assigned to Mr. Biden." The man didn't move. "Look, lady, I don't care who he is. I'm not moving. Let him sit somewhere else." Whispers began to stir in the cabin. Phones discreetly came out of pockets. Passengers started filming. Still, Joe remained composed. "I'm not here to cause a scene," he said softly. "I'll take another seat if that helps." But the flight attendant shook her head. "Sir, I'm afraid we must ask you to move." The young man smirked and leaned back further. "Not happening." A hush fell over the cabin. Joe Biden didn't shout. He didn't call security. He simply stood, adjusted the strap of his duffel, and turned to walk to the back of the plane. But a small voice from row 3 called out, "Mr. Biden, you can take my seat." It was a teenager, maybe 17, sitting next to his mother. They looked at each other and nodded. Joe stopped in the aisle. "I appreciate that, son, but I'll be fine." "No, really. You shouldn't have to give up your seat to someone who doesn't even care." Joe turned back around. He looked at the young man in 2A, still lounging defiantly. Then he looked at the teenager offering his seat. And for the first time since stepping onto the plane, Joe Biden smiled. But what he did next would be far more powerful than any argument. Joe Biden walked gently down the aisle toward the back of the plane. Past murmuring passengers and sideways glances, cameras were no longer discreet. The entire cabin had seen what happened, some embarrassed by the disrespect, others curious how a former president had handled it with such grace. The teenager from row 3 stood up anyway, despite Joe's earlier protest. "Sir, please take my seat." Joe turned around once more. He studied the boy's face, earnest, respectful, maybe even a little starstruck. The boy's mother nodded in encouragement, and with a humble tilt of his head, Joe accepted. "All right," he said, "but only if I get your name." Daniel Ruiz," the boy replied with a grin. "Well, Daniel, I owe you one." Joe took the seat in 3A. Daniel and his mother moved to the row behind. The man who had refused to move still reclined arrogantly in 2A, oblivious to the impact of what had just happened, or perhaps too proud to admit it. For the next 20 minutes, the crew finished boarding the aircraft. Biden sat silently by the window, hands resting on his lap, eyes distant. He wasn't angry. He was reflecting on the state of things, the cost of civility, and how easy it had become to disregard respect. A young woman across the aisle leaned toward him. "Mr. Biden," she whispered, "I just want to say thank you for how you handled that." He nodded slightly. "Sometimes it's not about winning. It's about showing people how not to lose themselves." As the plane lifted off, the air inside the cabin felt thicker than usual. You could cut the tension around seat 2A with a knife. The man in the seat had his headphones back on. scrolling through his phone, chuckling now and then. But several passengers nearby weren't laughing. They looked at him with something between pity and contempt. One older gentleman leaned over and whispered, "That seat doesn't make you important, son. What you just gave up was far greater than a window view." But the man only smirked and said, "Whatever, old-timer. He's just another politician." Except he wasn't. As the in-flight meal service began, Joe declined everything except a glass of water and a packet of peanuts. The flight attendant, now clearly more attentive to him, offered a warm smile. "Thank you for staying calm earlier. We didn't know how to handle it." Joe replied, "Most problems don't need force. Just patience and sometimes a little bit of silence." Across the aisle, Daniel looked over and smiled. "You ever get tired of being the bigger person?" Joe chuckled softly. "Only when it doesn't help someone grow." There was a pause. Then Daniel leaned forward. "Do you think that guy will ever realize what he did?" Joe glanced ahead toward 2A. "I think he already knows. But admitting it? That's harder than it looks." And as the hum of the engines continued, something subtle shifted in the cabin. Not because of authority, but because of character. 30,000 feet in the air. The silence inside the first-class cabin spoke louder than any voice. Conversations had quieted. The passengers weren't just watching a flight unfold. They were witnessing something more intimate. A silent confrontation between ego and humility. Victor, the man in seat 2A, remained fixed in his posture, sipping a scotch with exaggerated ease, but the edges of his confidence had begun to fray. Every now and then his eyes darted sideways toward Biden. Joe, on the other hand, seemed unmoved. He stared quietly out the window, occasionally sipping water, or glancing at the seat-back safety, card with mild amusement as if reading it for the first time in decades. Suddenly, Victor leaned slightly back in his seat and muttered just loud enough, "Still don't get what the big deal is. People act like he's royalty." The woman in 2C, a pediatric surgeon on her way to a conference, turned toward him. "It's not about royalty. It's about respect." Victor chuckled. "Respect for what? He's not president anymore. He's just another guy in a suit." A voice came from behind. "Daniel, he didn't need to be president to earn respect today." The statement landed hard. Victor turned slowly to look at the boy. "You're just a kid. You don't know anything about the real world." Daniel met his eyes without fear. "I know enough to see when someone's being rude for no reason." That comment hit deeper than Victor expected. His jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. Instead, he turned back to his drink, letting the silence soak the cabin once again. Across the aisle, Joe closed his eyes for a moment, then reached into his bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It was worn and creased, with a faded American flag sticker on the cover. He flipped through a few pages, his pen scribbling something inside. Someone leaned over and asked, "Mr. Biden, if you don't mind, what are you writing?" He smiled gently. "Just some thoughts. Sometimes flying clears the head more than a speech ever could." The older gentleman from earlier, row 1D, turned toward Victor and said, not unkindly, "Son, one day you'll realize what just happened here. Not because you lost your seat, but because you missed a moment to be better." Victor stared straight ahead, breathing heavier now, pride at war with realization. His voice, barely above a whisper, said, "I didn't ask for this. I just wanted peace." A quiet flight. Joe looked up from his notes, his tone calm but direct. Sometimes peace isn't the absence of noise. It's the absence of conflict within. Victor glanced back again, his fingers fidgeting with his glass. "People like you always talk in riddles," he muttered. Joe replied, "Only because plain truth makes some people uncomfortable." There was no aggression, no anger, just an overwhelming sense of stillness that made every word heavier than it sounded. As the flight crossed over the Rockies, clouds thick and golden outside, passengers who'd once only seen Joe Biden as a political figure now saw something else. A man unwilling to humiliate, but unafraid to stand for dignity, even when it came at his own expense. Victor, meanwhile, shifted in his seat for the first time, not out of comfort, but discomfort. And for the first time since boarding, he didn't look like a man in control. The unraveling had begun, not of power, but of pride. By the time dinner service rolled out, the cabin had settled into a hushed tension. A gentle clatter of trays and murmurs echoed through first class. But everyone was aware. Something had shifted. The man in seat 2A, Victor, sat in silence now. He'd removed his headphones. His jaw was tight, his eyes unfocused. He wasn't looking at Joe Biden anymore. He was avoiding him. Joe, meanwhile, calmly unwrapped a roll from his tray and offered it to the boy behind him. "Still hungry, Daniel?" Daniel smiled. "Thanks, Mr. Biden, you don't have to share." "I've got enough," Joe replied. "Always do." Across the aisle, the woman in 2C watched the exchange. She turned toward Victor and said quietly, "You should know. My father flew with him once, back when he was a senator. Said he gave up his seat on a train so a soldier could sit with his fiancée." Victor didn't answer. He was biting the inside of his cheek now. The flight attendant arrived with dessert. As she placed Victor's plate in front of him, he asked, "Who really is he to you all? Why does everyone act like he's different?" She looked at him for a long moment, then answered, "Because he is." Victor took a deep breath, then leaned back and stared at the ceiling panel above. The oxygen mask sign, the reading light, the thin strip of plastic, it all suddenly felt sterile, small. His eyes drifted forward to Joe, who now had his reading glasses on and was scribbling again in his notebook. "You think you're better than me?" Victor asked. Joe didn't look up. "No," he said plainly. "Then why is everyone acting like you are?" Joe sighed gently, finally lifting his gaze. "I don't think anyone's better than anyone else. But I do think some people carry their pain differently." Victor squinted. "Pain?" Joe closed the notebook and folded his hands. "You're loud because you want to be seen. I used to be that way too. Before I lost my wife, my daughter, my son." The entire cabin stilled. Even Victor's expression changed. "You lost them?" Joe nodded slowly. "In different ways. But yes." Victor was silent. "You learn," Joe continued, "that grief humbles you. Doesn't ask permission, it just arrives. And once it's there, you have two choices. Let it harden you, or let it break you open so you can feel the world again." Victor blinked fast, as if trying to hide something. "I didn't know." "You don't have to," Joe said. "Not about me, but you should know about yourself." Victor looked away, jaw trembling slightly. "You don't have to keep fighting everyone, Victor. The seat, the space, the attention, that's not where value comes from. It's how you treat people when no one's watching." Now passengers were no longer pretending not to listen. From row 4, a woman clutched a napkin. A man in 5C looked toward Victor not with judgment but with quiet hope. Victor leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice low now. "I've spent my whole life trying to prove I belonged somewhere. I don't even know why anymore." Joe nodded. "That's the thing about pain. If you never look it in the eye, it'll drive every choice you make." Victor didn't speak again, but the weight in his chest had shifted, away from arrogance, toward understanding. And up in the sky, somewhere over Nebraska, a man who thought he had everything began to see just how much he'd lost by refusing to feel. As the pilot announced their initial descent into Washington, D.C., the cabin lights dimmed, and a pale amber glow washed over the first-class cabin. Seatbelts clicked, window shades shifted, but all eyes occasionally returned to the same place, seat 2B, where Joe Biden sat quietly with his hands folded, and 2A, where a once defensive man now looked utterly still. Victor hadn't said a word in over 30 minutes. It wasn't defeat. It was reflection. His gaze wasn't fixed on Joe anymore, but on the small screen in front of him, dark and unused, like he finally saw the emptiness of the noise he used to fill himself with. Joe leaned slightly toward him. "You okay?" he asked gently. Victor cleared his throat, his voice rough with something he hadn't let out in years. "I think I've been trying to impress people who probably never even looked at me." Joe offered a slow nod, and maybe ignoring the ones who already did. Victor looked up, eyes glistening. "You said you lost your wife and daughter. How do you live through that?" There was a pause. Joe didn't rush. "You don't live through it," he said. "You carry it. And sometimes that weight teaches you how to walk differently." Victor exhaled, closing his eyes. "I'm not proud of who I've been. Not just today, but for a long time." Joe reached over, not with a lecture, not with a quote, but simply placed his hand on Victor's shoulder. "You still have time to change that." As the plane descended through streaks of cloud, a peace seemed to settle over Victor that hadn't been there when they left L.A. And then something unexpected happened. From behind, the boy, Daniel, stood, reached forward and tapped Victor's arm. When Victor turned, Daniel handed him a small folded napkin. On it was a messy crayon drawing of the plane, 2 stick figures in the front row, and a little caption at the bottom. "It's not where you sit, it's how you sit there." Victor held the napkin in his hands like it was something sacred. He swallowed hard. "Thank you," he whispered. Daniel grinned. "You looked like you needed it." When the wheels touched the tarmac, it wasn't just a landing. It was a moment of arrival in more than one sense. A man who boarded angry and armored had left something behind in the sky. His pride, his front, his fear. As passengers stood and reached for bags, some nodded toward Joe. A few whispered, "Thank you," but he didn't respond with speeches. He just smiled, tired but content. At the gate, as they began to disembark, Victor lingered beside Joe. "I owe you," he began. Joe raised a hand to stop him. "You owe it to yourself," he said. "Be kind to the next person who reminds you of who you used to be." Victor nodded slowly, eyes full of something close to peace. "Mr. Biden," he said, pausing, "thank you. Not because you're Joe Biden, but because you saw me when I couldn't see myself." Joe gave a quiet smile. "That's all any of us need, Victor. To be seen, and to be reminded we can be better." As Joe Biden walked off the plane, he disappeared into the terminal crowd, not as a former president, not as a name, but as a man who carried others not with power, but with presence. And behind him, a changed man held a crayon napkin like it was a key to a door he never knew was locked. In the end, this wasn't a story about seats, status, or politics. It was a story about grace at 30,000 feet, and how sometimes the most powerful change starts not in a debate, but in a moment of stillness beside a man who chooses humility over victory.